All who are thirsty, all who are weak, come to the fountain. Dip your heart in the stream of life. Let the pain and the sorrow be washed away in the waves of His mercy. As deep cries out to deep, we sing, come Lord Jesus, 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 come Lord. All who are thirsty, all who are weak, come to the fountain. Dip your heart in the stream of life. Let the pain and the sorrow be washed away in the waves of His mercy. As deep cries out to deep, we sing, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus. Holy Spirit, Holy Spirit, Holy Spirit, Holy Spirit, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come. You are holy,
You are holy,
you are mighty,
you are mighty,
you are worthy,
you are worthy,
worthy of praise. I will follow,
I will follow,
I will listen,
I will listen,
I will love you
I will love you
all of my days. He is Lord of lords, He is King of kings, He is mighty God, Lord of everything. He's Emmanuel, He's the great I am, He's the Prince of Peace, who is the Lamb. He's the living God, He's my saving grace. He will reign forever, He is Ancient of Days. He's the Alpha, Omega, beginning and end. He's my Savior, Messiah, Redeemer and friend. He's my Prince of Peace, and I will live my life for Him. You are holy,
You are holy,
you are mighty,
you are mighty,
you are worthy,
you are worthy,
worthy of I will love and adore him. I will bow down before him. He's my Prince of Peace, and I will live my life.
Good evening. I'm Phillip Hines, and we welcome you to our Bible class this afternoon, this Sunday afternoon. And we're glad that you could join us. We ask that you take your Bible and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 27. 1 Samuel 27, and we'll start in that text in just a moment. I don't know of any changes in the announcements that we mentioned this morning. We do want to call to your attention that next Sunday night, we will be in the classroom in the old auditorium. We will resume our in-person classes next Sunday night, and then we will do that for the next Wednesday night on March the 3rd, begin our Wednesday night in-person classes as well. So make plans to be with us. It was a great joy today to see so many people back and how the auditorium was full, and it just looked good to see everybody here, and hopefully we keep praying that this COVID is going to continue to go down and we can get back to do the things we enjoy doing and worshiping and studying the Bible and fellowshipping with one another. If you are a guest tonight, this is the first time you've been with us on our Bible class. We are studying the life of David on Sunday night, and we will continue with this study next Sunday night. We will not stop it and go into something different, so just make plans to be with us. We will be live streaming the adult class on Sunday night and Wednesday night as well. It's in the old auditorium, but we're looking at the life of David, and we've been seeing some interesting things. It's just like David's story never ends, and it's a story that's always up and it's always down. We have seen David chased by Saul for some period of time. We have seen David with the opportunity to kill Saul, to be free of being chased and to be able to go back home. But David, because Saul was God's appointed, would not do such a thing. We've seen good things about David, and we've seen some bad things about David. We worked our way thus far to 1 Samuel chapter 27. Now, as you look at these chapters, actually chapters 27 through 30 of 1 Samuel, on the surface you look and you say, well, maybe there's not a lot there to talk about. I noticed that some of the commentators and some of the folks that deal with the life of David, that when they come to these chapters, they sort of look over them or just barely mention them. But I thought we would have a whole lesson on these 3 chapters because I think there's a tremendous lesson for us about carnality and how carnality works in our lives as Christians. And we've titled this lesson, as you see, The Disease of Carnality. And I think by looking at this story, we can get a little bit more familiar with how it works in our life. Our lives are like David's lives or any Bible character's life, and that is, it's up and down. Sometimes I refer to our lives as yo-yo lives. We're up and we're down. Sometimes in our lives as Christians, we live on top of the mountain. And sometimes in our lives, we have to go down into the valley. And it seems like that the valleys always come after we've been on the mountains. And you can see story after story in the Bible about this. We'll see it tonight, but Elijah. Remember how Elijah had that great victory on Mount Carmel and defeated those prophets of Baal? And it's just shortly after that great victory in his life that he's under a juniper tree and he wants to die, going from the mountain to the valley. You see in the New Testament and some of the characters there, for example, Peter in Matthew 16. Matthew 16, Jesus asked Peter, he says, Peter, he said, whom do you say that I am? And he says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, blessed Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed that to you. This was a high moment in Peter's life because flesh and blood had not revealed this to him. But then a little later on in that chapter, just a few paragraphs later, Jesus is talking about his death. And Peter sort of recommends Jesus for talking about his death. And Jesus has to look at Peter and say, "Get behind me, Satan." There in that one chapter, he'll go from the mountaintop down into the valley. And another thing that I love about studying characters in the Bible, not only do we see they have ups and downs, but the Bible is very honest about these people. Even though David is portrayed as a man after God's own heart, we see the bad things about David as well. We see how the Bible will take a person, a Bible character, and they will point out warts and all, good and bad. Now, in our last lesson that we had, we saw the best in David. David was on the mountaintop. Remember, this was the second opportunity he had to take Saul out and to deal with Saul. But he would not get revenge, and he would not go against God's anointed. David's on the mountain. This is a great time for him. We're seeing his relationship with God, and we're seeing his great faith. Well, today in our text, we're going to see David at his worst. And I think we can relate, as I said a few moments ago, to this story. So let's get into the story. We're going to spend most of our time in 1 Samuel 27. We will look at just little bits and pieces of chapter 28, chapter 29, and 30 to finish out the story. So as we think about the disease of carnality, and as we watch David as he flows toward going away from God and going to that which was not godly, we see first of all David's decision that's made. And this decision is made in the 1 Samuel chapter 27. Now, as we break that chapter down, first of all, let's look at the cause of this decision that David made. What we're going to see here as we read verses 1 through verse 4, we're going to see that David, believe it or not, here he is. Remember, he's high on the mountain, and he's done a great thing, and he's got great faith in God in 26. But now in chapter 27, he's going to join forces with the enemy. And he's going to betray his own people, Israel. Let's read together now, verses 1 through verse 4, and see what happens. And David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul." Notice how he's down. He's negative. "There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of me, to seek me any more in any part of Israel. So I shall escape out of his hand." Then David arose and went over with the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Moach, king of Gath. So David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath. So he sought him no more. David decides that he's going to go down and make friends with the Philistines and live down there. Now, the question I guess we've got to ask is why? Why leave your people, even though you're being chased by Saul? And why in the world go down to this place called Gath and live there and live among the enemy? Well, I suggest to you 2 or 3 things here probably. Right off the bat, as we begin to read there in verse 1, we see that there's pessimism. I mean, as you begin to look at verse 1, he says, "Now why shall I perish someday by the hand of Saul?" David thinks it's over. David thinks he's going to die, that Saul is going to get him, that there's no way in the world he's going to be victorious. Now, you can understand maybe David's situation here as you think about it. Here he is. He's got 600 men and their families. They're soldiers. He's got his family, and they're migrating. They're just being chased all over the place. It's hard to keep up that many people. It's hard to take care of that many people when you're on the run. So it's easy to get down. It's easy to think maybe there's some better way for me to take care of my men and my family. We can relate to that. in our lives, if we think about it. Many times in life, we get tired of waiting on God. David had been promised. He'd been promised, you're going to be king. But it sure doesn't look like that David's going to be king, does it? I am telling you, it looks like, man, and he's thinking that Saul is going to get me. And so he just gets tired of waiting on God. And as we'll see in a moment, he just takes matters in his hands. We've done that. Sometimes we ask God about a job. Sometimes we ask God about dealing with our children, issues with our children or with our mate. And it seems like God's not listening. And maybe God has given us promises through his word that he's going to be with us, but it doesn't seem like God is keeping his promises. So I would say, first of all, there's this pessimism that causes him to make the decision to go down and to live with the Philistines. Another thing that I see here is that he surrenders to humanism. He surrenders to humanism. Notice there in the text, he says, the best thing I can do. The best thing I can do. In other words, David says, I'm going to have to take matters into my own hand. I'm going to have to control my destiny. And so he begins to make decisions for himself. Now, up until this time, we've been seeing David, when he got in difficult situations, to rely on God and to pray to God and to talk to God about this issue. But you know what we're going to find now? We're going to find he's taking God and put him over here somewhere. And for the next 16 months, David is not going to pray. He's not going to talk to God. You're not going to hear him in the Bible use the name of God. He's not going to write any songs. He's not going to even be thinking about God. He's taking God and he's put God out of the issue. He's taking God and put him out of sight. And now he's just going on David and David's thoughts and David's opinions. And folks, when we think about carnality, this is always the beginning of the disease of carnality. And that is when you begin to take matters into your own hands. When you stop going to God and saying, God, how can you help me? When you stop leaning on his word and on his message and lean on his promises. And you say, I'm going to have to control myself. So I think these are the two big reasons why David would go down to spend time with the Philistines and live there among them. He's negative. He doesn't think that he's going to live. Saul's going to get him. He needs a place for his men to live. And they need to get off the run. And David has taken God out of the picture. David begins to live under his own control. So David makes the descent from the hills of Judea, and he heads down to the plains of the Philistines. And that was the same way spiritually with him. He's on a down spiral spiritually. Now let's continue reading. And now let's see the compromise. We've seen the decision and what caused it, but let's look at the compromises of his decision. We see this in verses 5 through verse 7. Then David said to Achish, if I have now found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Now the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was 1 full year and 4 months. David made some compromises here. That's what happens when you leave God's people and you go down to the enemy. You're always going to make compromises. There was a compromise, I think, of his faith. I think David compromised his faith. As we talked about a while ago, God had promised him, you will be king. Instead of leaning on the promises of God, David placed his trust on the assurance of his enemy. Here is an enemy and says, okay, I'm going to give you a place. You can go and you can stay there. Now, on the surface, this seemed right, didn't it? I mean, think about it for a moment. It seemed right for David because all of a sudden he was going to have some peace. Well, as we're going to see, it was temporary peace. It's the way it is when you go off to the world, when you go off to the enemy. It may seem like a little peace for a while, but it's only for a while. Think about it. Here he is. He's in this place. They have a place to live now. Saul has stopped. Saul's not going to go down and deal with the Philistines, so Saul has stopped chasing him. That was a great thing to happen to him. Secondly, David has the acceptance of a king. Saul had not accepted him, but now he's got a ruler here that's accepted him, even though it was a Philistine ruler. And then thirdly, think about this. David and his men and their families finally had a place that they could call home. So everything seemed like this was the right move to go away from the people of God and to put God aside and to go down to the enemy. That's what the devil wants you and me to think, folks, when we make that kind of decision in our life. He wants us to think that we have made, when we turn our back on God, and we turn our back on the church, and we turn our back on the Bible, and we walk after the world. He wants us to think that we've made the right choice. He wants us to feel good. Well, David did for a little while. But David lost the most important thing in the world that he had, and that was his nearness to God. David's pen had dried up. He couldn't write any songs. He didn't pray to God. He didn't talk to God anymore. So he compromised his faith to go down to the Philistines. Tell you something else he did. He jeopardized his following. He jeopardized his following. As we just read a few moments ago, he's there in the Philistines for 16 months. For 16 months, David exposes himself and his men and their families to the pagan customs of the Philistines, to the false gods of the Philistines. And if there's one thing about carnality, let me tell you, it's contagious. This disease of carnality and going after the world and turning to that which is carnal and leaving God, this disease is contagious. It is a disease that spreads slowly, and it is a disease that's fatal. Now, you know that David had a tremendous influence over his men, and you know that they would follow him wherever he would go. And now he has taken them and he's exposed them to the carnality, the paganism of that land. Let's move on. Now let's notice the consequences. Let's notice what happens when you make a decision like that. When you decide to turn your back and set God aside and put him over here, and you start going on your own, and you start making these decisions and you go down to the enemy, what happens? Verses 8 through verse 12. Notice. And David and his men went up and raided the Gershites, the Gerzites, and the Amalekites. For those nations were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as you go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. Then Achish would say, Where have you made a raid today? And David would say, Against the southern area of Judah, or against the southern area of the Jerahmeelites, or against the southern area of the Kenites. David would save neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, saying, lest they should inform on us, saying, Thus David did. And thus was his behavior all the time he dwelt in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, He has made his people Israel utterly abhor him. Therefore he will be my servant forever. That's what's going on. They've got a place now in Philistines. They've got a place in Ziklag that's been given to them. They've got this home, but they're not farmers. The only thing they know is to fight and to war. And so David decides, what we're going to do, we're going to go raid these particular people or these camps in the southern part of Judah. Now, the king here of Gath, The king here thinks that he's raiding the Israelites. Well, David's smarter than that. David doesn't want to raid the Israelites. He still wants to hold on to the Israelites. You see, when you look at the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, they were not the people of Israel. But David, when he found out, or at least he wanted the king to think that he was raiding Israelites, to strengthen the connection that he had with this Philistine king and this Philistine leader. And David knew that this was a lifestyle of deceit, but he fed that deceit. And the reason the text says that when he would go into these places and he would kill everyone is because he didn't want any witnesses. Any witnesses getting back to the Philistines to say, we're not Israelites. And here's what David is doing. Think about this. And this is what happens when you go into carnality. This is part of the disease of carnality. You leave the Lord and you go off into that which is carnal in the world. Think about it. He was trying to live between two camps. He did. He was wanting the Philistines to think that he was truly for them and with them, and to be able to hold on to the things he had there in the plains of the Philistines. At the same time, he didn't want the Israelites to get so angry with him, and he still wanted to have that connection with the Israelites as well. That's the way it is. We'll see that in just a moment. We'll talk a bit more about it. When we go off into the world, many times we still want to hold on to some things of God, and yet we still want to hold on to the world itself. That's what happens. Now, David puts himself in an incredible dilemma. I'm in an incredible dilemma. And what we're going to do, we're just going to read bits and pieces from chapter 28 and 29 and 30 and see the dilemma that came upon David, because now he's trying to hold on to Israel and the Philistines. And the king is thinking, the leader is thinking, he's going after these Israelites and he's killing them. We begin reading in chapter 28 as we look at David's dilemma, verses 1 through verse 2. That happened in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for war to fight with Israel. And Achish said to David, "You assuredly know that you will go out with me to battle, you and your men." And David said to Achish, "Surely you know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Therefore I will make you one of my chief guardians forever." I wonder what David was thinking here. I wonder if he was thinking, I got some problems. I got some troubles. It would be probably something like a 2 to 3 day journey to the battlefield. I wonder what was going on in David's mind, because now Achish is taking him and his men with him to fight the Israelites, David's own people. So here's the thing. When you leave the Lord and you go off into the world and go off and pick up with the enemy, you may try to hold on to both sides, but eventually you got to let go of one. Eventually, you can't live in two camps. You just can't do it. There comes a time you have to make a decision. Whether I'm going to serve the Lord or I'm going to serve the world. Now, let's pick up the story. Let's move over to chapter 29, and let's look at God intervening on this. David's in a dilemma here. I mean, the king's got him. The king thinks he's killing Israelites, and he's going to go with the king, and he's going to help the Philistines fight against the Israelites. God sort of intervenes. Verses 1 through verse 5. Notice. The Philistines gathered together all their armies at Aphek, and the Israelites encamped by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines passed in review by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men passed in review at the rear of Achish. Then the princes of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the princes of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me these days or these years? And to this day I have found no fault in him since he defected to me." And the princes of the Philistines were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, Make this fellow return, that he may go back to the place which you have appointed for him, and do not let him go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with that, what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men? Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? The other Philistine leaders didn't like it. I mean, they said, this is a guy they wrote songs about. He's killed Philistine after Philistine after Philistine. This has to be a trick. Maybe they're thinking that David is sort of in cahoots with Saul, and that Saul set him down there so that David could turn against the Philistines in the heat of the battle and wipe out the Philistines as well. Well, I think, as I said, this is sort of God intervening. Now let's go to chapter 30. And let's look at this last chapter, and we'll make some comments and wrap up. Let's read verses 1 through verse 6 of chapter 30, and notice what happened. David and Amnon have returned now because they've been sent back. The Philistine princesses did not want him and his army fighting, and so they come back home. That happened, that's to Ziklag. When David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag attacked Ziklag. Now remember, the Amalekites, this is one of the groups, one of the three groups that David was going up in the southern part of Judah and was killing and stealing from. Verse 2, and have taken captive the women. They've come, the Amalekites have come and taken captive the women, that is of David's army and family, and those who were there, from small to great. They did not kill anyone, but carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was burned with fire. And their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. And David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's two wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. Now David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. Now, did David make a good decision? When David decided to leave the people of God and to go down to the enemy, and carnality took in and he decided to do things on his own, did he make a good decision? I mean, look where David is. Right now, in the eyes of the Israelites, he's a betrayer. In the eyes of the Philistines, he is a spy. And in the eyes of his own men now, notice when they come back and everyone is taken, their home is destroyed and their families are taken, David's own men turn against him. And they want to kill him. His own men have turned against him. You see, the peace that he had when he went down and was able to get Ziklag and have his family was temporary peace. And that peace now had worn off. And David was now feeling the effect of a carnal lifestyle. That's what happens. That's what happens when you put the Lord aside and you go down and you join the enemy and you start serving the devil. Temporary peace, but there comes a time it wears off. And then you begin to feel the full effect of a carnal lifestyle. Well, let's notice the last part of verse 6. I didn't read this of chapter 30, but notice this. This is interesting. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Wow. It's been 3 chapters. It's been 16 months. David hasn't sung a song. He hasn't prayed about God. He hasn't prayed a prayer to God. He hasn't mentioned the name of God as far as the Bible is concerned. He's on rock bottom. He comes to his senses and realizes what's happening, what he's done. David did what a lot of us do when we get in times like that. He had reached the bottom. He had taken matters into his own hands. And he found out that taking matters in his own hands just simply brought misery and grief and turmoil. And so he turned to God, where he should have been all along. He brought God back into the picture and brought God back into his life. And God was able to make his strength available. He didn't turn on David, as our God is, a great God. He didn't say, David, for 16 months, look where you've been. You've been living with the enemy. You've been lying to these Philistine rulers. They thought that you were up here killing Israelites and all this. And no, David, I'm not going to, no, it wasn't God's way. I said this a lesson too before, but as I think of David often, I think of that prodigal son. The prodigal son, you remember, he went off. He left the father. He wanted to do it his own way and take life into his own hand. And so he goes off, and he had some pleasure temporarily, right? And then what happens is, after that, there was the full effect of the lifestyle of carnality that hit him. He's in a pig pen. What does he do? He comes himself, he picks himself back up, and like David, he goes back home. He goes back to the father that he had left. Now let's read, for our last reading, verses 7 through verse 8 of 1 Samuel 30. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, please bring the ephod here to me. And Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. David appeals to God. And what happens? Well, we don't have time to read the rest of the chapter, but let me tell you what happens. David got everything else back. But more importantly, not only did he get his family back and all that was taken, but he got his spiritual health back. He got back where he needed to be with God. And he got away and out from under the rule of David himself. Now, let me make some closing remarks. I got about 5, maybe 10 minutes here at the most in the time that we have together. And let me make some closing remarks. I want us to go back and sort of rethink some of the things that we just studied tonight. And I want us to see an analogy of what David was and what we might become. And to see this thing about carnality, maybe the best way to put it is, I want us to see a comparison between David and a carnal Christian. A lot of similarities. Maybe this will be a good sign for us. If these things start happening to us, that maybe we're wandering more to the world and to the devil, and we're leaving God behind. Here's the first thing that I noticed, and that is with David, as we saw, he started living by sight and not by faith. When we do that in our lives, folks, we not be aware of things. When we start living by sight instead of faith, as we've said several times already, David took matters into his own hands. He relied on his own understanding. He started walking by sight. When we get to that point in our life that we turn our back on God and we start making the decisions, let me tell you, we're headed toward the enemy. Here's the second thing, and that is one of the things that you see about carnality is that you begin to spend more time with the people that are opposed to God. David goes down and he lives with these people, the enemy, for 16 months. That's what happens. I've seen it over and over through the years with Christians who were strong and Christians who loved the God and Christians who were serving and working, but all of a sudden they started walking by sight and they were enticed to be with the enemy. And there was some pleasure and they were drawn to it. And what happened was they began to spend more time with the enemy. They began to spend more time with the devil and his associates than the people of God. You got to be careful when that happens because they'll usually have a whole lot more influence over you than you will them. Here's another comparison I see. And that is that David, he tried to keep both camps pleased, right? I mean, he wanted Israel to still like him, and he wanted the Philistines to like him. David didn't want to be so pagan that he couldn't, be connected with the Israelites. And he didn't want to be so Christian that he couldn't be connected with the Philistines. And what happens is, usually, you end up and you accept neither one. I was thinking, I don't know of a more miserable person in the world than a person who's known God and who's loved God and who turns away from the world and begins to go after the world. And at the same time, they want to hold on to maybe some of the Christian things and the Christian friends, and they want to pretend maybe a little bit that they are connected with God, but at the same time, they want to hold on to the world, and they're torn because they got enough Christianity in them to make them sick and sorry that they're doing the things they're doing in the world, but they got enough world in them that they can't give themselves completely and totally to the Lord. Comes a time you have to make up your mind in life whether you're going to serve the Lord or you're going to serve the devil. You're going to serve the Lord or you're going to serve the world. Because if you just keep trying to hang on to both, what happens is you just, on Sundays, you're trying to put in, or when you come on Sundays, or your little bit of time you spend with your Christian friends, you're just putting in an appearance that just won't do any good because your heart's in the world. Besides that, think of the bad influence that you'll have. Let me mention briefly also two symptoms. We've talked about this disease of carnality, and I mentioned two symptoms here that connect with what we're saying. And that is, what you see here is that you lose your vertical focus. You lose your vertical focus. Remember, David became very pessimistic. And David stopped talking to God, and David stopped singing. David put God aside. That is the first step in carnality. That's the first step in going toward the world. And that is simply losing your vertical focus. And here's the second symptom I see with that, and that is David lost his horizontal purpose. He lost his horizontal purpose. And what I mean by that is, as we've said so many times already, he became concerned about himself. He stopped worrying about his influence on other people. He was just wrapped up in David. He was more concerned about David than anything else. Carnality. It'll bring temporary peace. But folks, it's not really peace. You can go off into the world and you can partake of the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. It may be good for a little while, but it doesn't last long. And then you'll begin to feel the full effects of the disease of carnality. It'll all come home. It'll never make you happy. It can't give you the peace that you want and the happiness and the joy that you want in life. There's a land where I belong. There's a land where you belong. You've got to decide if you're going to be in it. You've got to decide which land you're going to be in. God has given us a land. God has given us a place where we belong and where we need to be and what we long for. We have to make the decision. If we're going to be in the land of God, the land of the Israelites, or the land of the enemy, the Philistines. I don't know, maybe tonight you find yourself in a strange land. You find yourself in a land and you're away from home. You're far away from home. And this has been a picture of your life. You found a little peace among the enemy for a little while. But now you don't have the peace. And your life is not like it ought to be, and you know it. And there's a misery in you because you still got a little bit of Christianity. You still got a little bit of God in you. It's pulling on you. What you need to do is stop thinking about self. Put God back in your life. where he needs to be. You need to come back to God. You need to say, God, I was wrong. And you need to come back and you need to put him first place in your life. Well, that's a good picture, I think, of the disease of carnality. And if you're in that situation that David found himself in, situation of deceit and worldliness, you can come back and God will hear you. If you're sincere and honest, God will hear your prayer and God will forgive you. Maybe that's what you need to do today. Hope this has been profitable to you. Next week, we're going to continue. There's more to come. And I'm telling you what, as we've said, there's more about the life of David, another character in the Bible. And there's more to come, a lot more ups and a lot more downs to come in David's life. And so make sure you join us. Be with us in person next Sunday night at 5 o'clock as we continue this study. If not, you be with us online, and we'll be there to bring the lesson for you. Hope you have a great week this week. God bless you. And if we can be of any service or any help to you here at the Hartselle Church of Christ, please call us, 256-773-6124. Have a good night. Have a good week. Thank you. God bless you.
I'm coming back to the heart of worship, and it's all about you, Jesus. I'm sorry, Lord, for the thing I've made it, when it's all about you, Jesus. There's none like you. No one else can touch my heart like you do. I could search for all eternity long and find there is none like you. There is none like you. No one else can touch my heart like you do. I could search for all eternity long and find there is none like you. Hide me now under oceans rise and thunders roar. I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are king over the flood. I will be still and know you are God. Find rest, my soul, in Christ alone. Know His power in quietness and trust. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are king over the flood. I will be still and know you are God. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are king over the flood. I will be still and know you are God. I will be still and know you are God.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss! The Father turns His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory.
Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom.
But this I know with all my heart: His wounds